Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Digital Identity 360. This is one of my favorite episodes. We have a chance to collaborate with Rebekah Moody, who's our Director of Fraud and Identity Market Planning, and talk about our second half Cybercrime Report. It's always fun to go through it. So Rebekah, welcome.
Thank you very much, Frank. Great to be here.
Thank you. It's interesting, and I'm going to foreshadow a little bit on a future episode. We're going to do one of these things in Spanish for LATAM because there's so many interesting trends coming. But we find this report fascinating, and it's been really adopted by the industry at large, and folks are really relying on it for information. So maybe speak to a couple of the interesting points. I'll tee one up for you. I thought it was really fascinating that, if you look at this report, we saw 17 billion transactions in the second half of last year, and of that 17 billion, almost 20% were bots. So speak to the kind of continued proliferation of bot attacks and what we're seeing across the globe in that regard.
Yeah, I think that is probably one of the most interesting trends for me, Frank, that's come out of this report. One of the things I found fascinating looking at the attack kind of makeup from this half was that actually human-initiated attacks had actually fallen slightly in this half, but bot attacks had grown by 142% year on year. And to give you an idea of where some of those bot attacks are originating, we're seeing a lot of attacks coming from the APAC region, so Malaysia, Vietnam, South Korea,
right.
As well as from Brazil. And I almost feel like bot attacks are kind of giving some of those growth economies the opportunity to almost kind of put their stamp on the cybercrime world stage, if you like.
Right.
They're quick. They're cheap. They're a really quick way of sort of monetizing stolen identity credentials, testing stolen lists of identity credentials really quickly. And so, yeah, I think it gives those kind of smaller growth economies almost the chance to kind of build like a cottage industry, if you like, of cybercrime. So I do think it's a really big risk. I mean, obviously the risk is greatest to the e-commerce industry. So we see most of those bot attacks targeting the e-commerce industry. So that's usually on a login stage of the customer journey. So essentially fraudsters are kind of attempting account takeover with those stolen identity credentials. So that feels like the sort of most vulnerable,
Right.
most vulnerable industry.
For sure. It's so interesting you said that it's cheaper. I always find it fascinating. We as an organization and our customers are always focused on operational efficiency. How do you do things cheaper?
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think the bot folks have realized, hands-on keyboards, whether it's good guys or bad guys, are more expensive and harder to do. And
Yeah.
so, let's go to something that's cheap, efficient, and, we know the bots are that, in fact, very cheap mechanism where they can kind of compromise accounts. What's also interesting, Rebekah, if you look at the report, is there's been a huge increase in bot attack, but also a corresponding huge increase in mobile bot attacks. So maybe speak to the mobile angle a little bit.
Yeah, mobile's a really interesting one for us because, as you know from the report, mobile is still the safest way to transact. So we see about 61% of our network traffic now coming from a mobile device, but only around 40% of the attack volume comes from a mobile device. So it's still a safer way to transact overall. But what we are starting to see is this kind of noticeable shift in certain mobile attacks in certain industries and in certain regions. So it definitely feels to us like fraudsters are kind of seeing the opportunity in mobile. They're seeing the volume shift of customers moving to that channel as a kind of preferred way to transact.
Yeah.
And they're sort of saying, this is where we need to be as well.
Yeah.
So I'll give you a couple of examples of interesting mobile attacks. You pointed to one. We are seeing mobile bots in the network more and more. We haven't necessarily seen mobile bots so much in the past when we've been doing analysis. They're popping up in the network. Some other interesting mobile attacks that we see, a strong instance of fraud on mobile tethering.
Wow.
So in financial services, if someone is tethering their desktop session via a personal hotspot, that transaction is 2.4 times more likely to be fraud than if they were connecting via a Wi-Fi, for example. So that's a really interesting one for us. Likewise, we're seeing mobile rat attacks. So that's remote access Trojan attacks via the mobile channel. Now, again, that used to be something that we predominantly saw on desktop. that's now also shifting over into the mobile channel, and we're seeing that as a kind of fraud MO, specifically on mobile. So I sort of feel like mobile attacks are a really interesting one for us to watch for 2019, to see how they're going to evolve and to see whether that volume shift continues over into the mobile channel as well.
Absolutely, and it's emblematic, Rebekah, of the sophistication of the fraudsters, because they understand human behavior. And it's interesting, you look at a lot of organizations where they say you go to a hotel, do not use the Wi-Fi because it's compromisable, tether to your phone, right?
Yeah.
And so I think they understand the security posture and protocol of organizations, and they're saying, how do we, take those vulnerabilities and use them to our advantage?
Yeah.
So very, very interesting. The other thing that's interesting as you go through this is, obviously, the whole purpose of these bot attacks is to scrape credentials and to compromise identities. So once again, we've had an identity abuse index. We measure that abuse across our network. Speak a little bit to that trend.
Yeah, the Identity Abuse Index is one that we have followed right from the inception of the Cybercrime Report. And I think what it does really well is show you the kind of impact of stolen identity data that is coming from these huge breaches that we're seeing in the news. So if you look at our Identity Abuse Index, what it's showing you is the percentage of attacks per day that we see across our entire network. And when we see these huge kind of spikes in attacks that we show in red on our graph, they're generally corresponding to some of the biggest attacks that we see and hear about in the news. So again, it feels like fraudsters are kind of taking that stolen identity data, using it while it's fresh and using it while it's less likely to be detected, because maybe the kind of business or the end user hasn't even realized that they've been compromised yet. And they're using it in those kind of mass scale attacks. And that's when we see these kind of huge peaks in the index. It's also really interesting for us. We're looking at the index regionally. So as we're looking at our regional reports, say in LATAM or in APAC, we're looking at that identity abuse index regionally as well, to pick up some of the kind of regional nuances and attacks. So for example, particularly in APAC, we're seeing the impact of that huge bot volume in the identity abuse index as well.
That's right. It's interesting. You can't get away from the fact that fraud is global. I was at a conference this week, Rebekah, and there was a constant theme, and I still a misperception, I think, on the part of some organizations that, hey, I'm a U.S.-based organization, I don't have to worry about this. And the reality is these networks are global. They communicate effectively and efficiently. They share information, and they lead to these attacks. And, it's interesting, for example, one of the great parts of the report was the fintech summary in the fintech industry. When you're dealing in an industry where the imperative is to get money out into the marketplace as quickly as possible and in a frictionless experience, if possible, you look at some compromises there that are very, very interesting. Speak a little bit to our fintech view in this report.
Yeah, so I think fintech is an interesting one again, because where we potentially see some greater vulnerabilities is often in the payment stage of the customer journey. And I think when you're thinking about some of the fintech industries, maybe a new online loan provider or a kind of fintech financial services provider, it's often their kind of, online processes which haven't totally been kind of streamlined yet. And there are vulnerabilities in that process, and fraudsters are totally exploiting those.
That's right.
So, a fraudster would probably see a kind of fintech loan provider, for example, as a key opportunity where they can kind of target a vulnerability in that new loan application process, take out multiple loans in a kind of bust out or a Ponzi scenario, build those loans up, paying one off against another until they've kind of maximized the loan amount that they can take out, and then they kind of cash out with no intention to repay that loan.
That's right.
So it definitely does offer fraudsters a very kind of quick and easy way to, or not necessarily easy, but depending on the company, but a quick way to monetize stolen credentials. So I think that's an interesting one.
Quick and lucrative.
That all of our lights have gone off.
That's all right. We had a phone go off here earlier, so we're having that kind of day. Yeah, it's interesting because fintech provides a very lucrative opportunity to quickly monetize and get out. So I think that makes it a very vulnerable, and appealing target, where these guys look at it and go, hey, if I can put together 5 or 6 loans quickly, cash out, that could be tens of thousands of dollars that immediately pay off on the vulnerability and compromise. So very, very interesting. Another interesting part of the report that's new, Rebekah, and then I get one more question after this, but we have this network heat map. You alluded earlier to some of the network issues, but the network heat map is very, very cool. Speak to that part of the report.
Yeah, that was one of the pieces that we were most excited to release this report. We haven't managed to track networked fraud in quite the same way as how we've managed to do it in this report. So we show a heat map in the report of digital identities that we see are operating a fraud network across more than one industry or more than one organization. So obviously the greatest correlation of that fraud is within the same industry. So perhaps a bank, two UK banks, for example, you might see the same fraud network operating across those two banks. But one of the more interesting things is that we actually see a strong correlation of the same digital identities, the same end user operating across multiple organizations across different industries. So we see, for example, a strong correlation between banking and cryptocurrency. Now, it may seem obvious, but actually being able to directly link fraudulent behavior across different organizations, across different industries, really gives you a sense of how kind of global the fraud problem has become. And I think at ThreatMetrix, we're in this really unique position because we're working with digital identity intelligence across our global network, across our global customer base. We have quite a unique position to be able to detect that behavior and obviously help our customers to mitigate against it. So it's a really exciting kind of development for the Cybercrime Report that we haven't managed to kind of directly show in the past. And it's something that we're hoping to develop in the next report as we go through 2019.
Yeah, it's exceptional and very cool. It really speaks to the idea of empowering the network, which is our theme for this year's summit. And the reality is that fraudsters aren't siloed. As we said earlier, they're intelligent, they're sophisticated, they're agile, they speak to each other and communicate effectively. And they found ways to link these kind of, as you said, various industries together. And I think the expansiveness of our network now provides us that opportunity to create these linkages for our customers to say, here's what we're seeing. So well done on that, Rebekah. That's a very, very compelling part of the report.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Absolutely. So here's my curveball at every one of these things. What do you think the biggest trend for first half of 19 will be?
I know I shouldn't say I'm excited to see about mobile attacks, but I think for me, the tipping point from going into seeing more mobile attacks than desktop attacks will be a really key one for me, because that's the point where I would say fraudsters are actually kind of saying it doesn't matter how difficult an attack is, we're going where the money is. And obviously we know that fraudsters tend to kind of migrate to the lowest hanging fruit. They migrate to where the money is. But mobile has historically been the harder channel to target. But I do actually think that in 2019, we may see that kind of tipping point shift into more mobile attacks than desktop. And I think if that happens, that will be quite a big story.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think if you see how our mobile traffic has just been growing, kind of year over year, I think we'll see that attack vector come through. The other one, I think, from my perspective, that will continue to be very interesting for us will be the omni-channel kind of attacks where you've got synthetics maybe opening up accounts and then somebody calling to a call center and saying, hey, I want to buy something on this brand new account I've created. So I think that bringing together the omni-channel and that fraud vector will also be very interesting in 2019.
Absolutely. And I think if you look again at that bot trend, that's essentially the start of the funnel of that kind of omni-channel kind of pattern, because essentially the bot is the kind of, the quick identity testing. And then once that identity credential has been validated, the fraudster is then taking that validated identity credential and using it in a further attack. So I think one of my aspirations for the report is to be able to actually track that path of a fraudster and track that path of fraudulent behavior across different use cases and different industries to really understand the kind of fraud makeup of a kind of an end-to-end fraud attack, if you like.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And folks, it speaks to the quality of this report, and Rebekah and her team do a fantastic job putting it together. Rebekah, always a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Frank.
Always great to see your knowledge and depth in this subject matter. So thanks for attending and sharing your time with us.
Thank you very much. It's been great to chat to you.
Absolutely. And folks, check out our Cybercrime Report. Comes out twice a year now. It's fantastic information, full of great insights on where we're headed as a company, what we're seeing out there, and how we can help you. Take care, everyone. Bye.